So there's one guy from First Kings that you have to keep in mind this week, and his name is Jeroboam. Jeroboam was a king after Solomon. He put up these gold calf statues out for people to worship, which was not great. And so when God asked the Israelite people, like, hey, why are you following this guy? Why are you following this king and worshiping these calves? And the people are like, Jeroboam, I barely know him. Hello everybody and welcome to our journey through scripture. My name is Austin and today we are looking at the book of 2 Kings. So as stated previously, there are a couple things that we have to remember about 1 Kings before we can go into 2 Kings. So let's remember that the writers and editors of Kings were trying to get across 2 points. First, that you shouldn't worship any other gods, and 2, that you shouldn't worship anywhere except Jerusalem. We also, of course, have to remember King Jeroboam, who was a king in the north in the kingdom of Israel, and who did some really terrible things and worshipped some other gods. And so God is not too happy with the people of Israel, the northern kingdom, as we go into the second part of the book. And of course, we have to remember that at this point in history, as we're going from 1 Kings into 2 Kings, there are 2 kingdoms. There's the kingdom of Israel in the north and the kingdom of Judah in the south. The kingdom of Judah in the south has people on the throne from David's line, and so God is generally more okay with Judah than with Israel. So that's where we pick up in 2 Kings. 2 Kings tells the stories of these 2 kingdoms from the time of Elijah all the way to the time of the destruction of both kingdoms. So that's a big span of time. We can break 2 Kings up to a couple of different parts. The first part is chapters 1 through 8, which tell the stories of the 2 prophets Elijah and Elisha, 2 prophets with very similar names. Chapters 9 through 16 tell the stories of the kings of Israel and Judah and how they're generally terrible. In chapter 17, we hear about the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel because they have all followed in the footsteps of King Jeroboam, that terrible king who put up those calves, and they've either worshipped other gods themselves or not torn down those calves and left them up for other people to worship. Chapters 18 through 23 are more terrible kings, this time terrible kings of Judah, with a couple of good kings thrown in. And eventually, in chapters 24 and 25, we get the destruction of the kingdom of Judah under the Babylonians. We're going to spend most of our time today in the first 8 chapters, the stories of Elijah and Elisha. Right away in chapter 2, Elisha, who is the younger one, he's the protege of the master Elijah with a J. Elisha is told that his master is going to be taken away by God. And so Elijah, the master, this sort of all-knowing prophet, says, is there anything I can do for you, my protege, this person that's coming after me? And Elisha, the protege, says, please give me a double portion of your spirit. Now, this could mean that Elisha is basically asking to be considered his master's firstborn son, because firstborn sons got a double portion of inheritance compared to the rest of the siblings. Or it could mean that Elisha is asking for double Elijah's power, which some people think is right because Elijah, the master, did something like 8 miracles, and Elisha, the protege, did something like 16 miracles. So that's, double portion. Either way, it's clear that Elisha cares a lot about his master, and so Elijah says that he will grant this, and then right away, Elijah and Elisha see this chariot coming out of heaven, this fiery chariot, and Elijah gets into the chariot and is carried up to heaven in a whirlwind. That makes Elijah one of 2 people in the Bible who never actually die and just get taken away by God. The other person was Enoch, who was Noah's great-grandfather, and you can read about him back in Genesis 5. So Elisha literally takes up his mentor's mantle or cloak, which is some more family cloak imagery, and then he goes out to be Israel's new prophet. Elisha does a whole bunch of miracles in Israel. A lot of them are very similar to his master's miracles, including multiplying oil and multiplying bread, and even bringing back a boy who seems to have died by giving him what looks like mouth-to-mouth resuscitation in chapter 4, so lots of similarities. Probably the weirdest story about Elisha, though, comes at the end of chapter 2. It's just a couple of verses. It's chapter 2, verses 23 through 25. They go like this. So Elisha went up from there to Bethel, and while he was going up on the way, some small boys came out of the city and jeered at him, saying, "Go away, bald head! Go away, bald head!" When he turned around and saw them, he cursed them in the name of the Lord. Then 2 she-bears came out of the woods and mauled 42 of the boys. From there he went on to Mount Carmel and then returned to Samaria. Now, what the heck are we supposed to make of this story? Was Elisha just having a bad day, or what was going on? How do we justify this story? Well, I want to argue that we shouldn't. There are a couple things I could tell you about, like, the reality of this story, such as the fact that at this time there probably weren't woods near Bethel, and the fact that the Syrian brown bear would have been about the size of, and is about the size of our American black bears, and as such would have a really hard time mauling 42 people at once. But I want to zoom out here and ask a bigger question that I think is relevant to these small sort of one-off stories that happen once in a while, and that is, does it matter if this particular story actually happened? Because if it did happen, then clearly Elisha is trying to teach the people something, and if it didn't happen, then the authors and compilers of 2 Kings are trying to teach us something. So either way, we're looking at a lesson here. We can both say the injury of a bunch of kids is bad, especially if it's for, like, bullying you for being bald, while also trying to figure out what the lesson might be. Most likely this story was supposed to illustrate that the people of Israel were so terrible at the time that they weren't even teaching their kids about, like, the fourth commandment about honoring your parents, or how they should honor other adults and elders, and especially ones that serve God. In chapter 5, we meet Naaman, who's an army captain from Aram, which is a place just a little bit north of Israel, which is now Syria. Naaman has some kind of skin problem, and he hears from an Israelite servant girl that there might be a prophet in Israel who can help him out, so he goes to see Elisha. He brings a ton of treasure to pay Elisha with, and he also brings a letter from the king of Aram recommending him as a good person to the king of Israel, and, like, he is prepared, he is ready. Chapter 5, verses 9 through 15 say, "So Naaman came with his horses and chariots and halted at the entrance to Elisha's house. Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, 'Go wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be clean.' But Naaman became angry and went away, saying, 'I thought that for me he would surely come out and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, and would wave his hand over the spot and cure the leprosy. Are not Albana and Parfar, the rivers of Damascus, better than the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean?' He turned and went away in a rage. But his servants approached and said to him, 'Father, if the prophet had commanded you to do something difficult, would you not have done it? How much more when all he said to you was, wash and be clean?' So he went down and immersed himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God. His flesh was restored like the flesh of a young boy, and he was clean. Then he returned to the man of God, he and all his company. He came and stood before him and said, 'Now I know that there is no God in all the earth except in Israel.'" I've always loved the story of Naaman ever since I heard it on one of my Bible tapes when I was a kid. There's something so relatable about hoping for this big miracle, this big sign from God that you're okay now, and then just getting, like, regular life instead. As a perfectionist, I totally relate to Naaman, who's like, if we're not going to have a giant ceremony, what is even the point? But I think there's more going on for Naaman here, and that's why I'm making him the Queero of the Week. I think what's so relatable to queer folks, to LGBTQ plus folks about Naaman, is that he's spent a long time, maybe even his whole life, feeling bad, like physically and morally bad. We're not told exactly what's going on with his skin disease, but we know at least that it's not what we consider leprosy or Hansen's disease today, because that was, like, really contagious and might even cause some limbs to fall off, and he wouldn't have been allowed to be an army commander. So it's some other kind of skin disease. What he had was something that made him feel bad in his body and in his sense of self. All he wanted was a big miracle to fix him, and he was ready to pay big money, he was ready to go on a huge journey, he was ready to do painful rituals, anything that would make him better. For a lot of LGBTQ plus folks, this story about Naaman might sound familiar, especially if you've been in conversion therapy, or even if you've just spent, like, a long time by yourself fighting your identity and who you are, and that feeling that you are bad somehow. But Elisha is so unbothered by Naaman's problem that he just sends a servant. He doesn't even go out himself. He sends his servant out the door to say, just go dunk yourself in that river over there. He tells Naaman to do an incredibly easy thing, something that doesn't require any sacrifice or suffering. How often do we as LGBTQ plus folks think like Naaman does and think, that can't be enough, that can't be it, I must have to suffer more to be good? But what if we don't? What if, in order to get close to God in our own skin, all we have to do is listen and follow and immerse ourselves in God's love? Just a thought. Elisha does one more really cool miracle before he dies, and that happens in chapter 6. Essentially, an army is getting ready to attack Elisha because he keeps thwarting all of their military endeavors because he's a prophet and God tells him what's going on. So this army is about to attack Elisha, and Elisha asks God to blind the army, and God does. And Elisha pulls a "these aren't the droids you're looking for" moment and says, "Oh no, I'll go lead you to the guy that you want." So Elisha leads them directly into the walled city of Samaria and is like, "Okay, you're here, God, you can unblind them now," and God does. And they open their eyes, and suddenly this invading army is in the middle of the army of Israel, like surrounded, and the Israelite king is like, "Can I kill him now? Can I kill him now?" But Elisha says, "No way, invite them to the feast. We're all going to sit down and eat together, and then they're going to leave, and everything's going to be fine." And surely enough, they do just that, and Elisha is the only prophet that stops a war with a dinner party. Eventually, though, Elisha does die, and in chapters 9 through 16, we hear the stories of the kings of Israel and Judah, who are generally a bunch of screw-ups. We hear about the rise of Assyria and about King Tiglath-Pileser, who is like the most famous Assyrian king. You can actually look him up in your history books. He was a real dude. But he conquers Israel and essentially makes them a vassal state and requires taxes from them. In chapter 17, Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria decides that the money he's getting from Israel is not enough, and he totally goes in and wipes out Israel and resettles the land and takes all the people away as slaves. Verses 7 through 18 of chapter 17 tell us why this happens, but I'm just going to read you verses 8 and 9 because they kind of sum it up. They say, "This occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt, from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. They had worshipped other gods and walked in the customs of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel, and in the customs that the kings of Israel had introduced." That was a side eye to Jeroboam, by the way. He was the bad king of Israel that set up all the bad laws. In chapters 18 through 23, we hear about the stories of the kings of Judah, the leftover kingdom, the southern kingdom, and unfortunately, in a bunch of generations, there are only two good kings, and their names are Hezekiah and Josiah. Hezekiah destroys all of the altars and the worshiping places to other gods, which is really great, and he talks a lot to the prophet Isaiah, who we're going to get to know a little bit later. King Josiah, we've heard about before, right? He was the one that discovered the book of Deuteronomy hidden in the temple. So King Josiah goes to set out all of these reforms, and he really tries to get things back on track, but it's not quite enough. In chapters 24 and 25, we hear about King Nebuchadnezzar, who is the king of Babylon, and we're going to hear more about him as we go on here. But he sacks all of the southern kingdom of Judah and takes the people captive. Well, almost all the people. He leaves the very poorest farmers in the land to keep farming so that they can have more food up in Babylon, and he appoints a governor over them who will then report to the Babylonian king. The last thing we hear about in 2 Kings is that 37 years into this captivity in Babylon, the heir to the throne of Judah is let out of prison and allowed to sort of be under house arrest in the palace in Babylon. And so, there's a hint of hope, but that's where it leaves us. It's not a great ending to the stories of the kings of Israel and Judah, but that's okay because the whole story's not over yet. Tune in next week as we check out 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which are a whole book that give us a completely different perspective on these kings. When it comes to a showdown between the two versions of history, the one that we get in Samuel and Kings or the one we get in Chronicles, which one is right? Well, you'll have to come back and find out. I'll see you back here next week. Thanks so much to the supporters over at Patreon who make these videos happen, including Leanne and Aiden and Leah and Emmy. And if you want to support this work and check out the perks, you can do so over at patreon.com/AustinLionheart. Thanks again, everybody. I'll see you back here next week. And until then, keep reading.